And so, I guess I'll begin. Basically, what we'll do today is spend the first 25 minutes just about to go through an introduction on application process, the consulting interviews, both the behavioral and the case interview, and then we'll do the second part on a case. We'll do an actual mock of the case to let you guys see what it's like. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, and then feel free to interject any time in between. We're willing to oblige. Okay, so we know that all of you guys are freshmen. You guys are starting. So another round of introduction. I'm Jackie. I'm a master's student. I'm going to go into BCG in a couple months and start working. And
again, Varun, going to be starting at Bain. I'm undergrad studying CS, and yeah, pretty much it. So maybe we can start by sort of giving a very broad scope overview on what does the application process look like in consulting. And since I think most of you are freshmen, this is probably something you'll be looking at probably a couple of years from now, like maybe junior year when you start looking at internship recruiting. So maybe we can just give you kind of a brief, like the main highlights of what you should be looking at. So there's really, I guess the process will probably start roughly around early fall quarter whenever you end up applying. So if you want to apply for an internship for, say, next summer, and typically they take rising seniors as interns, you would probably be applying by like early October and having your interviews sort of in October, November timeframe. But you should really ideally be starting to think and starting to prepare far in advance of that. So I think one of the things that kind of makes consulting interviews unique, at least as compared with some other fields, is the approach to their interviews, and more specifically the case approach, which is something that I think typically involves a lot of practice, and that's kind of something that we're going to be focusing on today.
Great. And then just to carry on that, so the case, how many of you have heard about the case interview? Okay, all of them. So how about you just kind of came in, or put you on the spot. Well, what is a case interview? Can you tell us?
For consulting,
yeah.
It's like management consulting.
Yes, exactly.
So basically they will present you with like a basic client case, and then you just need to kind of solve the problem on the spot and then articulate it and then present it in a clear way with a conclusion. Okay. And the problem can be if this kind of like if it's M&As, if it's like a good target for like acquisition. It can be more like if this market campaign is a good one. And then probably the first step will be a market sizing question, do some quick mental math. Second part will be like more kind of like analyzing pros and cons, and the third part would be, based on your analysis, is like a good thing for our client to do, like this and that.
Okay, that's pretty fair. It's a good overview. So I guess there's no need for us. Let's go. No, just kidding. So that's good. And then I guess I want to just emphasize that case interviews. Many people approach it 2 weeks before their interview, but to really master it, to really have a really good opportunity and good chance to pass the case interview and land a job at Mckinsey and BCG and Bain, we recommend that you definitely start earlier. I think Varun started, at least a couple months before I started, probably even a year before I started the actual full-time, a fall recruiting season, and I practiced throughout the year to make sure I was ready when the fall recruiting came. So with that in mind, so that would be kind of case practice. So let's go into more detail on kind of who to practice case with, how to practice effectively, right? So can you, Varun, you want to give a shot on that?
Yeah, so ideally you want to be practicing with other people who are kind of as invested in your progress as you are. And a good way that a lot of people have done is kind of work with other people who are also interviewing. So if you know a few friends who are all also kind of applying to consulting, maybe you each give each other a couple cases a week or something like that, and then you're all kind of motivated to help each other and help yourselves as well practice. Another great resource, if you have that opportunity available, is to actually practice with somebody who's currently a consultant or somebody who's been an interviewer at one of these consulting companies. So I can give an example. In my case, I was pretty lucky because my dad had actually been in consulting, so kind of the summer prior to when I was applying, I did a couple cases with him each week and got some like pretty helpful feedback that way.
Yeah, exactly. And then just to add on to what Varun said, I'd say definitely practice with people, because I've had candidates who buy these books and then they read the books and then try to do it by themselves. That is not going to work as effectively as really practicing sitting down in a real interview type of format with an actual individual. And another thing I like to add is a lot of people have this one partner, right, or two partners that they practice with, and they practice all their 20 cases with this partner. I don't recommend that, because you want to expose yourself to the different types of cases and how different people solve cases. So I'd say at least have 3, 4, 5 people, quality people that you practice with, so that you can kind of pick the brains of the best and glean from the best of them instead of just hold on to 1 or 2 resources. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. Any questions so far? No? Okay, great. So I guess we'll talk a little bit more about networking, me and Varun. Okay, yeah, question please.
How many cases, for example, might you have practiced before your interview, and how many people did you do it with?
Okay, so I'll start. I probably practiced around 80 to 100. Wow. That's a lot of cases. And then I would say, I have a core group of maybe 3 or 4 people I practice with, and additionally I practice with another 4 or 5 just occasionally. So that's a lot of practice.
Yeah, for me it was probably about 50 live cases. Most of them, as I mentioned, kind of with my dad, but I also did a fair number with different friends that I had that were also going through the recruiting process. And on top of that, I probably looked through or watched people presenting at least another 100 or so cases.
What about for your Deloitte internship?
Oh, before that?
Yeah, before that.
That was when I just started, so I'd say maybe 10, 20. So
okay.
Yeah, not very experienced. Maybe that's why I didn't get into Mckinsey. We'll see. Okay, so I guess we'll talk a little bit more about networking and then the importance of networking. Varun, you want to?
Yeah, so I think all of the major firms that are going to be recruiting on campus, which is pretty much all of them, I think, which is kind of one of the reasons we're pretty lucky to be at Stanford, will have kind of on-campus recruiting events, which will typically be, they'll typically have a presentation of about an hour or so, an hour to 2 hours, and then basically have an hour or two where you can just kind of walk around and talk to consultants at that firm. Many of whom will be kind of Stanford alumni, so probably people who are very similar to you, or maybe just a couple of years beyond where you are right now. And these will typically, at least in my experience, these were typically kind of right when you came back to school, the first week of school, or the second week of school. And I found these really, really helpful, just in terms of getting to know a little bit more about the firms. So one thing that I can't really comment on, Jackie might have more input on this, is how much do those firms really value you showing up and asking them questions. I don't really know how much do they take that into account directly, but one thing that I think is really helpful is if you go to these events and you get to talk to a bunch of these people, you'll have a lot more cogent examples to give in your cover letter, or when you're kind of interviewing at those firms as to why is this firm a company that I'm interested in working for. Yeah, exactly. And to add on to that, if you were in your cover letter and you name dropped that I was in this workshop, I talked to this particular consultant, this conversation I had with this particular consultant really made me apply. Those were the things that recruiters will pick up, and actually the people who actually screen your cover letters and resumes might be the same people that you talk to in these workshops. So if they kind of see that you mentioned their names in the cover letters, it'll definitely help you. So that's another thing I wanted to add. So yeah, I think with that in mind, let's go into kind of the consulting interviews and the behavioral and, okay, please, another question.
When you're at these events, what are you hoping to get out of them? Specifically, how do you go about it? Yeah, so
I can just kind of talk about from my own experience. It was kind of, I wasn't that focused on that initial presentation, because they kind of just give very, at least in my opinion, very stock answers and stuff. So I was really kind of focused on at the end talking to people and really hoping to get a couple of specifics that I wouldn't have been able to find on the company website about things that are maybe distinct about that company.
So for example, what kinds of questions are good ones to ask?
Mm-hmm. I would say, in one of these workshops, for example, right? I would say, when you approach these consultants who show up for these workshops, I'd say ask them questions that they'll remember you for. I'd say don't ask, how do you like consulting so far? Ask them questions that are special, where they probably will have heard that question only once during that entire workshop, and then send them a follow-up email on that question saying, oh, I am Jackie, and during the workshop I asked about this particular question that bracket no one else has asked before, and then and thank you for your response, and then you can ask for some favors, maybe do a mock case, or kind of say, oh, now I've applied, I hope to have the opportunity to work with you. So something that kind of make you stand out, I'd say. And specific question-wise, you can really make up something.
What are some examples that have worked for you in the past?
Good question, great question. So do you have some of that, or?
I think.
I mean, I have an example. So this was during the Deloitte summer internship thing. So basically, I was talking with he was I believe the operations division manager for the San Francisco office, and one of the things when in his presentation he talked about using this particular software called Tableau. But basically over the summer I had worked at my summer internship. I worked extensively with Tableau. So basically I used that as a connection point with him, asking him about his project, the details of it. Oh, you had this problem? Well, I also encountered this problem. This is kind of how I went about it. So that's one way that you can sell, finding commonalities, and especially uncommon commonalities with the people that are presenting is a great way to get them to remember you.
Yeah. Another one specifically that comes to mind is kind of asking things about kind of how the career progression or how staffing works, because that's something that I think you typically wouldn't be able to find out just from their company website. So this actually wasn't me, but when I had gone to one of these events and I saw somebody else asking this question, which was kind of asking about how easy is it to kind of get staffed on projects in I think they were interested in the healthcare sector, and so they were kind of asking about how staffing works on healthcare projects and how it works to specialize early on versus later on. And so I think that kind of specificity is something that could be pretty helpful.
Okay. All right. So why don't we continue and then talk about the behavioral and the case interview parts. Varun, you want to?
Yeah. So I think the behavioral part is. We're going to be focusing, I guess, more on the case interview in this workshop, but the behavioral part, just to give kind of a brief overview, I think that's kind of more similar to what you would see in almost any interview in any company. And so typically these will be kind of questions like, why are you interested in consulting? Maybe tell me about some item on your resume, or tell me about some time when you showed leadership. From my experience, kind of most of the firms, the behavioral part of the interviews were kind of these very generic kind of questions, or I shouldn't say generic, because the answers are not generic. The answers should be very specific, but kind of questions that you would expect, maybe. The only firm that I think differed from this slightly was Mckinsey, where they had a very targeted behavioral section of the interview, where they kind of asked you to come up with to speak for about 20 minutes on one example from your life on X topic, and X topic is something that they would give you at the interview date. So that was something that I definitely had to prepare for a lot more, but for the other firms, the behavioral questions were kind of more standard, and I didn't really have to do that much extra prep on that. Yeah?
It's what?
So they will typically be something related to leadership, or a time when you showed leadership, or a time when you showed drive or ambition, something like that. So more focused on personality trait as opposed to an actual experience. But then you get to define which experience you want to talk about that kind of you think demonstrates that that personality trait best.
Okay, let's move on with case interviews. We'll talk about kind of three things: the interviewer mindset, which is, the idea of the case interview is for the interviewer to see if you are able to pass the case, not only, but also to be in the real job, to continuously pass, real problems in consulting. So the interviewer wants to see that you're not only able to pass this question, solve this problem, but if we hire you for Mckinsey, you're able to solve 9 out of 10 problems. So that is what the interviewer mindset is. So basically, with that mindset in mind, you want to approach this case interview and to show that you have a very rigorous and structured way of thinking. You don't want to. For example, one of the questions that they may ask is, say Uber wants a new market entry strategy for Vietnam, right? And then say if your dad works for Uber, and then you just give them a very detailed strategy for Uber, that probably solved that problem, but didn't show the interviewer that you have a very structured approach on how you would, approach, say, lift in the same, mindset. So definitely, show structure, show how you're thinking is more important than actually solving the particular problem at hand. And then in terms of the types of problems, I'll just continue. Basically, there are, as she has said, market entry problems, different types of mergers and acquisitions, profitability types of problems. How would you grow a business? How would you reduce the cost for the business? Really things that Mckinsey, BCG, and Bain does in real life. Anything you want to add, Varun?
No, I think you did a good job. Do you want to move on to the frameworks?
Great, yeah. So we'll continue on the frameworks on. So given in mind that the interviewer wants to know that you have a methodical approach, not methodical, a structured approach to tackle different problems, and that fact that there are different types of business problems, I think a logical way to think is how would you use a structured approach? What would be your structure, right? And then that's where case frameworks comes in, where frameworks are basically an approach that you can use at the beginning of every case to tell the interviewer this is how you're thinking about this problem, right? And then so we'll talk about kind of two major frameworks that are very common. And Varun, you want to start off with the first one, or?
Sure. So before we go into that, are there any questions at this point about sort of what the case interview is, what they're looking for, that kind of thing?
No.
Okay, great. So I'll start by talking about one of the most common kinds of cases that you'll get, which is a case about a company that has declining profit or has some sort of problems with their profit line. And that's one that sort of comes up a lot. And one way that is very typical of breaking this down, and pretty much any kind of consulting book you read will kind of offer a similar approach, just because it's a very standard kind of problem, is to kind of break up the problem of profit decrease into problems associated with revenue and with cost. And so the reason for this, or why this maybe is a good approach to the problem, is that this is kind of breaking the problem down into smaller, but mutually exclusive and completely exhaustive kind of categories, right? Because you know that profit equals revenue minus cost. So if there's been some sort of a problem in the profit line, there must either be some sort of a problem on the revenue line or on the cost line. And so breaking it down then, we can further break down each of these categories into, okay, so the revenue maybe has gone down. So at this point, what you might want to ask is just at a broad level, how revenue changes, how cost changes. And once you've gotten that information, maybe it seems like, okay, revenues are doing fine, revenues are about the same as always, but costs have suddenly increased dramatically. So maybe let's try to figure out what's gone wrong there. And then we can do a similar kind of thing where we want to break up costs into kind of mutually exclusive, completely exhaustive components, which would be kind of cost equals the volume of goods sold times the cost per unit of goods sold. And depending on what the actual case is, this volume and cost per unit might have slightly different names, but it's the same kind of concept. And then you could kind of explore both of these and try to, basically the main approach here is you're trying to narrow down the source of the problem by recursively breaking down the problem into kind of simpler chunks for you to look at. Yeah?
What about fixed costs?
Yeah, so fixed costs, ideally, if you're asking for the cost per unit, ideally fixed costs would be included in that by kind of amortizing the total cost divided by the number of units. But I think that's a good point, right? Like once you've found out that, oh, the cost of the unit has, say, increased dramatically, then you would want to figure out, oh, why has the cost per unit increased dramatically? And so one thing you might want to look at there is, oh, maybe I'll look at fixed and variable costs separately and try to break it down into those categories. So I think what you're saying is a good point, that even once you have kind of one of these numbers, you need to break it down further. And so something like fixed costs could kind of come in a layer below this.
Great, and then we'll do in the latter half of this workshop a actual mock case with me and Varun, and then I think we'll show something very similar on how you tackle a profit type of case, right? Mm-hmm. So and then I'll go into the second part, which is a business condition. I'll go over there. Yep. So and this is where kind of the second of two very common frameworks. The number one is profit, and then I always think about these two as very complementary to each other. Profit, you see, these are all numbers, right? Say Coca-Cola has certain million or $1 billion of revenue, right? Their compounded annual growth rate is 12% a year for the past 5 years. So these are all numbers, all quantitative. But you'll find, especially in top consulting firms at Mckinsey, BCG, and Bain, that if you ask the right questions about the quant side, and then you solve, okay, so it seems like our profit has decreased because that our costs have increased. that does not mean you've solved the case. That means that you found out quantitatively which branch is the problem. But then the second part that complements that is you have to find out qualitatively why has the cost increased. For example, has, say if we're Coca-Cola, has our raw material, which, water, for example, fresh, drinkable, potable water, has that increased because, the global warming and there's no more water or anything. So you have to find out kind of on the business condition side, like more qualitatively why this has happened instead of just the numbers or just the quant side. So that's where kind of the complementary framework, the business condition framework comes in, where I really like to break it down, any business, into kind of 5 major components, where kind of the 5 major pillars, which is kind of the market that this company is in, the customers it has or will have, the company itself, its merits, its expertise, the competition, what's happening in the competition, as well as the product they're offering. So just to take a hypothetical example, for Coca-Cola, they're in the market of soft drinks, for example, and then their customers are basically everybody. I travel globally, and then it's really they're in every single continent and country. Company-wise, they have what is their expertise? They have a strong brand. They've been in business for a long time. They have a lot of subsidiaries, whatnot. Competition-wise, they got Pepsi, they have, Dr. Pepper, I'm not sure if they're in the same company, but they have a bunch of, soft drink competition, and then their product is mostly soft drinks, but as well as complementary products. So I guess, in this case, how would you compound these two together? How would you kind of stagger one on top of the, okay, question?
So I just want to know what the third one was, the company, what does that mean?
A company is things about the company that will help you solve the case. So
I'm sorry, what was your example for Coke?
Okay, Coke, my example was that, for example, I said Coke has a very strong brand.
Oh,
that,
okay.
And the brand is kind of company specific, right?
Something, yeah, okay.
Exactly. So for example, if one of the strategies is, say, if you were Coca-Cola, how would you enter a new market, say in Nepal, in Asia?
Sure.
Then you can say, company-wise, we have the strongest brand in soft drinks, and we can outcompete our competitors, things of that nature. And so these are kind of the things. So how would you stagger them would be kind of just going back and forth. Say if the cost has increased, then you want to figure out ways to decrease the cost back down. You tackle into these more qualitative components to ask and poke around. Question, please.
Market versus customers, what's the distinction?
I would say the main distinction is that the market is kind of, so customers would be mostly the customers of your product, like who are the people that are buying Coke, whereas market would be more like what does the soft drink market as a whole look like?
Okay.
Yeah, and just to add on what Varun said, say one of the biggest questions that I always ask in market is say Coke is, again, we'll take Coke, the profit is decreasing, right? One of the market questions you can ask, say, I want to know about the soft drink market. Has the profit of all other companies, including Pepsi and all, have they increased similarly or even more? And that can give you an understanding if this problem is an industry-wide problem versus your own customers. Does that kind of make sense? Any more questions? Cool.
I want to just re-emphasize one thing that Jackie said, which I think was a really good point, which is that once you figured out what's the problem in a given case, like maybe you figure out the problem is that costs have declined, that's really only part of the way to the solution. And really, going back to, what's the interviewer's mindset? They want to know that you're going to be able to, if you're joining their firm, help clients solve their problems, not just identify them. And so going to more of this kind of qualitative information to look at like how can you actually address these root problems is really, really important.
So, looking at those two frameworks, right, you can probably figure out quantitatively what the problem is if you're in the case interview, right, that artificial setting. You can figure out the quantitative branch which the problem is. But when you come to business conditions, right, you don't have that kind of knowledge, at least in the consulting interview, right? So how do you go about answering the second framework? Because you don't have those details, at least not always.
I'll kind of answer them. So one of the things is that in consulting interviews, they don't expect you to have a lot of expertise in something, especially from undergraduate level.
Sure.
Maybe MBA-wise, they'll expect something more.
Okay.
But then you can still ask questions that you can basically ask for any business. For example, if say Coca-Cola or any business and say that their profit is down, what can you ask in these questions that can cater to any business? For example,
industry specific versus company specific, or something like that.
Exactly. Or for example, product. You can ask about, say, what are the products of Coca-Cola? as it pertains to this case interview, are we only considering Coca-Cola by itself, or are we considering 10 different products that we're targeting? And you can ask that for any type of industry. Does that kind of answer your question? Okay, yeah, great questions by the way. Great. So given that in mind, if no more questions, we could go ahead to do a mock case if people are interested in that.
Yep.
Before that, so firstly, in terms of how long the interviews are, what is the rough breakdown of these individual parts?
Yeah, so I can give you my experiences. So when I interviewed, for example, at Bain in the first round, there were only case interviews in the first round, and it was like about 25 minutes per case. I think BCG was the same, but slightly longer cases. I think it was like 40 minutes. And then Mckinsey, for example, did like 20 minutes of behavioral and like 40 minutes of case. So roughly cases, you'll have about 30 to 45 minutes for each case. Behavioral question, if you have it in the first round, will be about 20 minutes, or otherwise it might be in the second round as a slightly longer thing, like 20, 30 minutes.
Okay. And obviously there are various kinds of questions you can ask, right? Like M&A or like similar sort of operations or something like that. So could you maybe give us a rough overview to navigate that landscape? What are different types of questions?
Sorry, do you mind clarifying the question? Do you mean like what are different kinds of cases that they could ask?
Like so structurally, there are like different kinds of questions, right? Like numbers and everything might be different, but they'll have similar sort of models. What are some? Can you give us an overview of like what different kinds of models there are for these kinds of questions?
Yeah.
So for example, this like profit revenue model is like a very, very common one.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll kind of take a stab at that. So I always think about any given case as kind of two components, right? You have like the x-axis and the y-axis. The x-axis, I call it kind of the industries, right? So it could be, the case that the interviewer gives you could be in pharmaceuticals, in tech, in retail, right? In small business or anything. So I think that on the x-axis, and I think your question more is on the y-axis. What are the type of business problems they're giving
Right,
you?
right.
So that could be a combination of, I'd say profitability, definitely one of them. I'd say growth by itself is a common one that's different from profitability. So a question say Coca-Cola has a profit decrease versus Coca-Cola want to grow its business in Canada. And those are two different problems with two different frameworks to approach them. And even though there can be some overlaps. And then I would say, what are some other ones that you think are common in terms of the business problems?
I think M&A, which you mentioned, is a reasonably common one. Like this company wants to acquire this company or is considering different acquisitions. Another one that sometimes comes up is like capacity expansion. Like this company wants to open up a new factory or open up a new store, something like that.
Yeah, that's kind of.
Yeah, and I think the fact that there are so many of these different options, both on kind of the y-axis and the x-axis, like Jack was mentioning, is kind of why it's so important to practice so many cases. Because chances are, when the day comes, you're not going to get an exact industry and business problem that you've seen before. But hopefully, if you practice a wide variety, you'll kind of be able to generalize your approach to towards new problems.
Yeah, exactly. And I just want to kind of add on that is some people think that either you have the talent to pass the case interview or not. But actually, that's not true. With anything that you can practice, even with tech interviews, a lot of you guys want to go into Google. There are definitely websites that you can code a ton and then apply that code to the actual interview. So it's the same thing with cases. If you out of the x and y axis, you've practiced 20 out of the 100 possibilities. It'll it'll give you a good recommendation on what you should do on the other 80 once they show up in the actual case interview. Yeah. So let's move on to the mock case.